Today I'm going to be speaking to you about Devil's Island, the famous French penal settlement in French Guiana, and some of the notable people who actually escaped from Devil's Island, escaped their fate. But at the start of the cruise, I promised that I'd tell you a couple of other tales about a deployment that I did way back in 1979 on the destroyer HMAS Vampire through Southeast Asia. And when we left it last time, we were acting as the United Nations duty ship for the region. We had just picked up some survivors from a pirate attack upon a Vietnamese boat, and we'd taken those survivors back to Hong Kong. And then we continued our cruise. We were still acting as the UN duty ship as we cruised out of there, and I can tell you that the atmosphere aboard the ship was fairly sombre because of what we'd seen after this pirate attack. It was certainly the first time that I'd ever seen a dead body. I was 18 at the time, and it was fairly confronting. So as I said, the atmosphere on the ship was fairly sombre for the first few days. But then we started getting back into our normal routine and disciplines and things, and after a while that routine kicked in. Now, my normal routine when I was on a day watch, which I did happen to be on this particular day, was to get up early, go up to the mess, make a couple of cups of coffee, and then go up to the bridge to see what was happening. So the bridge was this area up here, and it was the only place on the ship with any windows. And that's why I like to go up there, just to see, what was happening around that day. It wasn't a ship like this where you could look out from your balcony or from any of the windows around the ship and see things. If you could go from your mess to get something to eat, to go to work, and be in those confines of that steel ship all day, every day, and not get to see any fresh air or see the sun. So that was my routine. I like to go up and see what was happening. So I made two coffees, went up to the bridge, walked in, and there was 5 other people on the bridge that morning. I gave one of the coffees to the duty signalman, who was a friend of mine, and put the other coffee down, walked over to the radar screen, and just had a look around and, okay, well that's that contact over there, and that's that contact over there, just to get an idea. And then I walked over to the chart table. Now, this was where the large map of the area where we were cruising was kept, and the officer of the watch's duty, one of his duties was to update this chart every half hour or whenever there was a change of course or speed. And the reason that I'd put my coffee down was that if the navigator ever found anyone anywhere near his chart table with any food or drink, well, you would find yourself in the scullery scrubbing filthy pots and pans for your foreseeable future. So went over there, and we were cruising in international waters off the coast of Vietnam. And lovely day, sun was shining, beautiful flats, calm seas, really nice. And I should describe a little bit more. Just underneath the bridge was what was called the operations room. And this was really the nerve centre of the ship. This is where the radar operators were, the sonar operators who the radar checked the air and the surface, the sonar under the water. The fire control system people were there, so that was the people who control all the weapons around the ship. Damage control was there. Around the corner we had the electronic warfare people whose role was to listen in to other people's conversations. That's just some people at the back moving some furniture. And the captain's cabin was around the corner as well. So that was the nerve centre of the ship, and every part of the ship was connected to the operations room. And then directly below there was the communication centre, or the ComCent, and this is where I worked as a communicator. And in there we received all the signal traffic from into the ship from outside. And around about 5% of that traffic came through via Morse code at the time, which is no longer used. But even after 40 years, I can still send and receive Morse code, which is a completely useless skill to have. But the rest of the traffic, 95%, came through via teletype. So you tune the radios to a particular frequency, the signal would come through, it would go through a set of cryptographic machines to decode it, and then it would print out on a teleprinter with 3 copies, or 3 original and 2 copies. And connecting these 3 areas of the ship was different communication systems, but the most commonly used was the voice pipe. Now, you've probably seen this in movies where there's a brass pipe with a big flange at the end where you can speak through and your voice is projected to another area of the ship. So we had a voice pipe between the bridge and the comsen, one between the bridge and the ops room, and one between ops and the comsen. And down these tubes was a cord, and at the bottom of this cord was a hollow plastic tube. And if a signal came in that someone on the bridge or someone in the ops room wanted to see, you'd rip off the front copy of it, put it in the tube, and you'd yell, bridge comsen in the tube. And the signaller would haul the cord up, take the signal out, and give it to whoever it was addressed to. Now, there was 4 different levels of signals. The first one, which made up about 45% of the traffic, was routine traffic. And this was stuff that either didn't have to be actioned at all or didn't have to be actioned for at least 24 hours. About 50% of the traffic was priority traffic. And this was stuff that had to be actioned by the person it was addressed to within 6 to 24 hours. And then the rest of it, the other 5%, was made up by immediate traffic. And this was information or a signal that from the moment the person who had drafted the signal handed it to the operator at one end, it had to be in the hands of the person it was addressed to within 1 hour at the most, but usually within half an hour. And the other level was flash traffic, but you never ever saw flash traffic. If you ever had flash traffic, which you wouldn't, it would be a very bad day. So, as I said, I was on the bridge this morning, and it was a beautiful day. I was about to head off downstairs and have some breakfast and get ready for work. And then all of a sudden, there was a very excited cry through the voice pipe. And it was bridge, ops, unidentified aircraft, bearing, whatever it was, travelling at supersonic speed, ETA our position, 2.5 minutes. And it was quite funny because we talked about it later. There was 3 people on this side of the bridge, and at exactly the same moment, they all turned their heads and looked at the 3 people on that side of the bridge. And the 3 of us on this side of the bridge, at exactly the same moment, turned our heads and looked at them. And it was, what? And then like a synchronised swimming team, all 6 of us at the very same instant turned our heads back towards the voice tube to look at the voice tube as if that was going to help us in some way. And then a couple of seconds later, there was another excited voice, and it was bridge, comsen, flash traffic in the tube, flash traffic in the tube. And that was it. The officer of the watch, who was just a young lieutenant at the time, immediately said, sound action stations. And the last thing I saw as I was racing through the hatch to get down to my action station in the comsen, 2 floors down, was him reaching for the phone to inform the skipper what was going on. And I raced downstairs, raced into the comsen and said, what the hell is going on? And it turns out that was the 19th of February 1979, and that morning, just before dawn, the Chinese army had invaded Vietnam, and it was the start of the Sino-Vietnamese War. Not really sure why they did it. They probably thought that everyone else has had a go at this, we might as well. But it was a war that only lasted a few weeks, about 4 weeks. And after that 4 weeks, under pressure from the Soviet Union, who was the Vietnamese main ally, and with a very bloody nose, the Chinese withdrew back across their borders. So that was over. But yeah, it was a pretty exciting time for us. Those 2 planes that were heading towards us, they were 2 Chinese jets, and they flew at low altitude over our ship at supersonic speed, which was very, very dangerous, because that sound barrier is actually a physical thing that if someone was walking across the deck, they would have been picked up and could have been thrown into the water. So yeah, it was interesting times for us. It was a little bit confusing for a while because we didn't know who we were taking orders from. We were acting UN ship at the time. Were we taking orders from the UN in New York, or were we taking orders from Navy office in Canberra? And eventually the skipper decided that we were an Australian naval vessel, and the UN flag came down and the white ensign went up, and we started taking orders from Canberra, and luckily for us, they ordered us out of the area, which we were pretty happy about. So that was that story. And now we're going to move on to Escape from Devil's Island. Now, Devil's Island is actually a physical island at the top of South America, up here. But it's also referred to, Devil's Island is actually referred to as the whole penal settlement that that formed as part of the colony of where the convicts were sent for France. And most of that penal settlement was on the mainland of French Guiana. And the background of this is after the Treaty of Paris, which was to end the 7-Year War, which Americans would and Canadians might know better as the French Indian Wars. France was in a pretty bad state. They'd lost their possession in Canada. They'd lost some of their possessions in the West Indies and other places as well. And one of the places that they were able to hang on to was French Guiana in the Treaty of Paris. And they thought that we better do something about this. We better populate this area because it wasn't populated at all. So we better send some people there so that we can hang on to this. So Louis XV sent 12,000 settlers there in 1764. And this didn't go very well at all. After only 18 months, there was only 600 survivors. They were told when they went there, when they were going there, that they would make their riches there. There was gold everywhere. You could just walk around and pick this gold up, and there was great opportunities there. But when they got there, they found that there was hostile tribes in the area, but there was also a lot of tropical diseases, and most of these people succumbed to these tropical diseases. And as I said, there was only 600 left after 18 months. And these people fled to 3 islands off the coast. And that was St. Joseph's Island, which was named after the patron saint of the expedition to go out to French Guiana, Royal Island and Devil's Island. And these 600 people stayed on these islands, trying to get away from the disease on the coast. Now, they eventually made their way back to France, and or most of them did, and they gave reports there about how awful this place was, this French Guiana was, and that caused big disturbances in France at the time. Slavery was introduced by the French in the early 1800s, and after a while, plantations were set up in the area, and these plantations flourished. People made a lot of money out of these plantations, which grew a lot of sugarcane, hardwood, peppers, and also other spices and things which were very, very valuable commodities. And so this was very successful for these plantation owners. But the French decided that they would abolish slavery in the year 1848. And most of these plantations were abolished because they didn't have the labour force to work the farms. So then it was decided that what other labour force could we get? And it was decided that convicts were the answer. Now, until 1666, if you were convicted of a crime in France, you would probably be sent to the galleys. And this is a little bit like Ben-Hur sort of stuff, where you're in the galleys and you're rowing there until eventually you die. But after 1666, there was no more galleys fleets. The era of sail had come in, and so these convicts weren't able to be churned over as they had been before. So they built these prison hulks, these huge floating barges they were anchored in harbours and bays off the coast of France, and convicts were chained together in twos of about 5,400 men on these barges. And these men would go ashore and work along the docks, and you've probably seen the opening scene of Les Miserables, where they're working through the dock area, and they'd get some sort of compensation, a few pennies per day for the work that they did. But in those days, if you were in prison, you didn't get 3 meals a day, and you didn't get a uniform and the luxuries that prisoners seem to have today. In those days, you had to earn the money or get it through charity or have your family send you money. So there was a lot of crime between prisoner to prisoner crime on these hulks. If somebody had something that you wanted and you tried to get it. So these hulks were known for the crime on board, the murders on board, and the local populace off the coast where these were anchored didn't like them being there. There was also lots of diseases and it caused more crime. So in 1851, Napoleon III ordered that these prisoners could be sent overseas to different colonies, of French colonies. And several ideas were mooted. There was Somalia, Angola, which were French colonies at the time. Haiti was another option for them. Even Texas was considered because that was a French colony at the time. But in the end, they decided that this would be good. We could send them to send them to French Guiana, and they could work on these plantations and help build up that area as well. So in 1852, they put out a call for volunteers from amongst the prisoners who wanted to go to this area. And conditions were so bad on these hulks at the time that they had over 3,000 volunteers to go. Eventually, 80,000 prisoners were sent there, and they were marched down to the docks and put onto a ship and sent to French Guiana. And most of the people sent were convicted of very serious crimes, murders, rapes, all those type of thing, but also political prisoners, people that they wanted to keep out of the mainstream area of France. Also repeat offenders, it was a 3 strikes policy. If you were caught doing something 3 times, then you'd be sent to French Guiana. And also women were eventually sent. And the idea being there that once a prisoner was released after he's serving his time, he would marry a woman convict and they would start populating the island or colonising the island. And part of that reason was that in 1854 they brought in a policy of forced residency. And that policy was that if you were convicted of a crime and sentenced to less than 8 years, when you served that time, you would have to stay in the colony for an equal amount of time. So if you'd been convicted of a crime and sentenced to 7 years in French Guiana, or Devil's Island as they call it, then once your time was up and you were released, you had to spend 7 years living on the island before you could come back to France. If you had been sentenced to a crime and sentenced to 8 years or more, then you were never going to be able to return to France. You had to stay in French Guiana and colonise the place. Now, that didn't work out so well in the end because when prisoners were released, they were given a bit of land to live on, but there was no jobs. What were they going to do? All the plantations and all the work was done by the convicts. There wasn't enough work to go around for free men. So they kept on committing more crimes, and that just exacerbated the whole problem. Even on the ships going over there and within the confines of the settlements, the jails, there was also a lot of prisoner-on-prisoner violence. And there was, even for the basic crimes, punishment was very, very harsh, and it was nothing for it'd be several guillotine executions every week. Virtually every day, prisoners died, and instead of being buried on the island, these prisoners were taken out in boats and dumped in the ocean around the islands, which encouraged sharks to come to the island, which disencouraged people trying to swim away and escape from the island. So worked twofold. And in this painting, you see the French officer saluting. Well, you can be pretty sure that didn't happen. It was just a case of they were taken out and they were dumped in the ocean. Now, the main facility was at St. Laurent, which was on the mainland, and most of the work crews were organised from St. Laurent to work on the plantations there, and then also out in the swamps trying to clear the land. But they also dispersed to other camps and islands. Solitary confinement was on St. Joseph Island, and political prisoners, all political prisoners, were sent to the actual Devil's Island, the little island off the coast. And at any one time, there was only ever 12 people on Devil's Island. And that's the solitary confinement cells at St. Laurent that you can see there. Now, one of the men, the famous people from Devil's Island, is a Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He was an officer of the General Staff of the French Army of Jewish descent. At the time, there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment throughout France, but especially in the army. It was rife. And when it was discovered that secrets regarding artillery were being sold to the Germans, suspicion automatically fell on him, on Dreyfus, because he was Jewish. There was a trial, he was arrested and there was a trial. It was a secret trial, no one was allowed to report on it. But if you have a look through the transcripts of the trial, which are available to see, you'll see that there was no evidence whatsoever. All it was that he had availability to this information, and so he must have done it. But there was dozens of other officers that had the same sort of access to this information. But he was convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and he was marched out into the middle of a parade ground, surrounded by thousands of French soldiers, and he was read his dishonourable discharge. His epaulets showing his rank were torn from his uniform, his buttons were cut off, and his sword was taken and it was broken. Now, the sword is a symbol of honour, so breaking that sword meant that he had lost his honour. Now, I remember as a very early recruit when I was 15 at HMAS Lewin in Western Australia, and I'd been in the Navy for all of 2 days, I think, and we were summoned down to the parade ground. We haven't even been issued with uniforms at that stage. We were summoned down to the parade ground. Because we were the newest intake, we were up the back, but everyone on the base was on the parade ground, over 1,000 people. And there was an announcement that 2 recruits had been caught smoking marijuana. They were marched out from the cells, out into the middle of the parade ground. The charges were read, the fact that they'd been convicted and found guilty was read out, and they were going to be dishonourably discharged. And their Australia tabs on their uniforms were ripped off to signify that this was no longer a uniform, it was only a shirt, and they were dishonourably discharged and then marched out to the gangway where a police paddy wagon was waiting for them, and they got into the paddy wagon and were taken away. And this was, wow, what an impression it made on a 15-year-old. I'd never touched marijuana since then. It was one of the reasons. But yeah, that's how serious it was at the time. And I mean, now if the same thing was, they'd probably just get a slap on the wrist. But yeah, Dreyfus was sent to Devil's Island. But at the time, even though there was thousands of French soldiers standing around silently watching this, there was a large crowd of civilians surrounding that as well. And they were yelling and screaming abuse at Dreyfus. And at one stage during through the whole ceremony, he yelled out, "I swear that I am innocent. I remain worthy of serving in the army. Long live France, long live the army." Now, as I said, he was sent off to Devil's Island in solitary confinement. But a couple of years later, in 1896, another officer took over command of military intelligence, a man by the name of Colonel Picard. He discovered more information about who was selling secrets to the Germans, and it turned out that it was a man by the name of Esterhazy, an officer by the name of Esterhazy. And Picard had this information, he had all the proof that he needed. Esterhazy was arrested. He was put on secret trial as well, but the army couldn't admit that they'd made a mistake with Dreyfus. So Esterhazy was found not guilty. As soon as he was found not guilty, he fled to England and never came back to France again. Picard wasn't happy about this because he knew that Dreyfus was innocent. So for his troubles, he was transferred to Somalia to keep him out of the way. He wrote letters back to France, though, explaining what had happened. And some prominent people got hold of this evidence, including the famous French Jewish author Émile Zola. And Zola took up the cause of Dreyfus. And over a period of time, there was so much controversy about what had happened. There was talk in France about the fact that we had this revolution to bring on liberty and justice and equality for all, but there's so much of this anti-Semitism happening within the community and with the army. And it caused massive disruptions amongst French culture. And in the end, Zola... this is the actual place on Devil's Island. This is Dreyfus's home on Devil's Island, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But Zola wrote a letter, an open letter to the President of France, which appeared on the front of a French newspaper. And in it he outlined all the evidence of why Dreyfus was innocent. And it was plainly clear that he was innocent. So he was recalled in 1899 to France. He was given another trial, once again in secret, and once again he was found guilty even though there was no evidence. In fact, the evidence was to the contrary, was that he was innocent. And this was because the French army couldn't afford the embarrassment of saying that they got it wrong. But he was offered a deal. You say to everyone, you let the public know that you did it, and we'll give you a pardon. We'll forget the whole thing. And he was pretty conflicted by this. I mean, what do you do? I mean, what would you do? His wife begged him, don't go back to Devil's Island, just go along with the deal. You've got 2 young children. We need you here. Please accept the deal. But people like Zola said, well, you can't admit to doing something, to a crime that you haven't committed. It's wrong to do that. You have to fight this, even if you have to go back to Devil's Island. So what do you do? Well, in the end, he decided that he couldn't go back. He told Zola, you've got no idea what the conditions are like back there. I can't possibly go back. So he accepted the deal. He also said that the government of the Republic has given me back my freedom, but it is nothing for me without my honour. And it took several more years before he was finally exonerated on the 12th of July 1906. All the evidence came to light, and he was exonerated, and he was allowed back into the army. And he accepted that position back in the army. He was promoted to major, and he was given the Legion of Honour, which is France's highest award for honour. Now, by this time, Zola had died, and the French government decided that his body would be exhumed and he would be placed in the same crypt at the Pantheon along with France's other great authors, Victor Hugo and Alexander Dumas. Now, if you think about it, Victor Hugo wrote Les Miserables, which was a story about how a man, even though he'd served his time, was persecuted by the French justice system, which sounds a little bit familiar because Dreyfus never got over this. He was always accused of he wasn't a traitor to the army by selling these secrets, but he was a traitor to France because of the fact that he'd embarrassed the government. And Alexander Dumas, as well as writing The Three Musketeers, also wrote The Man in the Iron Mask, which was a story about a man who was falsely accused of a crime and sent off to solitary confinement on a remote island. So does that sound familiar? Dreyfus went on to serve with honour during World War I. He was commander of an artillery battalion or detachment behind enemy lines. And he died on the 12th of July 1935, exactly 29 years to the day after he was finally exonerated. And that was his final escape from Devil's Island. But going back a bit, he was wounded at the ceremony to entomb Zola. He had gone to the ceremony, and a French journalist had come to that ceremony with a weapon, with a gun, and he fired 5 shots, one of which hit Dreyfus in the arm. And because this was the case of that he had been exonerated for the crime of treason, but a lot of people still felt that he was a traitor to France because of the embarrassment that he'd caused. And this is what this journalist was on about. The journalist was arrested and put on trial, but there was still this massive anti-Jewish feeling. And the journalist's defence was that he didn't mean to kill anyone or hurt Dreyfus, and he was only going there to frighten him. So in the end, the charge was downgraded to public nuisance, and he was given a small fine and allowed to go. So that was the sort of atmosphere around at the time. Now, one of the other famous people who was on Devil's Island, and you probably will all know this person's Papillon, Ernest Shackleton. He was born in 1906, and at the age of 17 joined the French Navy and served in World War I. When he came out, he was convicted of murder in 1931 of killing a pimp. He was probably a pimp himself at this stage, had a stable of his own prostitutes, and this person was a rival, and he murdered that pimp, even though he always said that he was innocent of the crime. In 1933, he was transferred to St. Laurent, but he was only there for just over a month when he made his first escape. And contrary to what it said in the movie, this escape was successful. He made it to Colombia, where he lived with a tribe of Indians there for some time. He became romantically involved with one of the ladies in this Indian village, which upset a couple of the other men in the village, and they reported him to authorities. He was arrested and sent back to Devil's Island, to St. Laurent. He was given 2 years solitary on St. Joseph's Island, and as soon as he got out of there, he tried to escape again. And this one wasn't so successful. He was picked up by bounty hunters soon after, and he was sentenced to another 5 years solitary confinement on St. Joseph's Island. While he was there, he was on half rations for a lot of the time, and that was because they wanted information about who had helped him with this escape, and he refused to give them the information. And if you go to St. Joseph's Island, which you go on cruise ships these days and get tendered in, you can actually see on one of the cells the name Papillon, which he had carved into the wall during his 5 years of solitary confinement there. After several more attempts, he was sent to Devil's Island, which was considered escape-proof. And that was because Devil's Island was surrounded by these huge, fierce currents and also lots of sharks. And so no one was going to survive these currents. But he watched the tides, as you saw in the movie. He watched the tides, and in 1941 he escaped by hanging onto a bag of coconuts and being dragged out with a rip after the last of a series of waves had come in. He actually got to the mainland and made his way to Venezuela, where he was arrested and put in prison for a year. But he was lucky that while he was in Venezuela, he met a local woman and they married, which automatically gave him Venezuelan citizenship. So he wasn't sent back to Devil's Island. He opened a restaurant there and became a bit of a celebrity in Venezuela because he'd tell his patrons all about his adventures on Devil's Island and his escapes, and was told wonderful stories. And eventually people convinced him that he should write a book about all this. And so he did. He named it Papillon. And in 1969 he returned to France and published it, and it became an instant hit all around the world. He starred in a couple of French movies about convicts and about Devil's Island, and then he was asked to become a consultant in the movie Papillon with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, and most of you would have seen that movie? Yep, great movie. So he was consultant to that movie, but unfortunately he died a couple of months before the movie was released in 1973, and that was his final escape from Devil's Island. Now, another man who became famous for his escape was a man by the name of René Bellenoit. He was born in 1899. He had a bit of a disturbed childhood. His mother was took care of the children of the Tsar of Russia, and she had said publicly that she loved these children so much, even more than her own children. So it wasn't not what you would want to hear from your mother, is it? His father was the chief conductor on the Paris to Orleans railway line, the express, and he was never at home at all. So he was raised by his grandparents until the age of 12 when they passed away, and then he was on the streets. He joined the French army and served in World War I, including the Battle of Verdun, where over 11 months, over 1 million men were killed all around him, and millions of others were wounded. And this had an effect. It must have had an effect on him, would have had an effect on anyone. He drifted off after the war and started some petty crime. He had a job at one stage as a hotel porter. And one day he went into a woman's room and she'd left her pearl necklace there. He stole that necklace, which was worth a fair bit of money. He took it to a local pawnbroker and pawned it, but he was soon arrested and he was sentenced to 8 years in French Guiana. 14 days after he got there, he escaped, but he was recaptured. But he soon escaped again. He made a second escape attempt with 9 other men. And this didn't go very well at all either. They had escaped into the swamps surrounding Saint Laurent, and they got lost. They got terribly lost. And for 2 weeks they wandered around the jungles of French Guiana. No food, no real water to eat, to drink. And things got to the stage where they were absolutely desperate. They decided that all they could do would they have to sacrifice someone and cannibalise that person to be able to survive. They actually drew lots for who was going to be the lucky person, but before they could do it, they were found by bounty hunters and taken back to the prison. He'd been secretly writing his memoirs about what was going on at Devil's Island, and in 1930 there was a new governor took over, and this person was supposed to be a reforming governor, a person who wanted to make things better for the convicts there. He sent the manuscript to that governor, who was very impressed with what he'd saw, and the governor invited him to be his clerk for a period of time. Eventually, after ingratiating himself with the governor decided to give him a year's work permit to go away and work on the Panama Canal, which he did. But he was supposed to return to French Guiana. He decided that he couldn't go back there. He didn't want to go back there, so he made his way back to France, where he was arrested and then returned back to French Guiana. Eventually, in November 1934, he was released. But under the policy of forced resettlement, he had to stay there. He was going to have to stay there for the rest of his life, and he didn't want that to happen. When he'd been back in France, he'd had a taste for that sort of life again, and he wanted to return to France. So he escaped with 5 other people who were also freed convicts who had been forced to resettle in French Guiana, and they made it to Trinidad initially, and then on to Colombia. And then in 1937, he stowed away on a ship to Los Angeles. The following year, he went to a publisher and published his book, The Dry Guillotine, about what had happened, what he'd done on Devil's Island, the conditions there. And this was an instant hit. The trouble was, he came to prominence, and the US Immigration Department told him they would have to leave the US. So he went to Mexico and stayed there for a while, and then after the attack on Pearl Harbor, where the US entered World War II, he decided that they had bigger problems than me, and he returned to the US. But he was promptly arrested and sentenced to 15 months in prison. Now, by this time, Warner Brothers had got hold of the book, and they wanted to use the book as a screenplay for a movie that they were producing. So they sponsored him, and he was given a valid US passport. And then Hell on Trial was published, and he worked as a consultant on the Humphrey Bogart movie A Passage to Marseille, which is broadly based on his book. In 1956, he became a US citizen and married an American woman. And the next year, at the age of 57, God, why would you do it? He had a son, which killed him. 2 years later, at the age of 59, he died. They'll do that to you, won't they? Now, Devil's Island itself has become was closed as a penal settlement only back in 1951, so not all that long ago. And it was still, even at that stage, it was still terrible, terrible conditions there. Most of the inmates were unable to return to France. It was a case of, just because you're free, we're not going to take you back there. If you want to get back, you've got to make your own way back. And most couldn't afford the passage or had no one to help them out with that. It's become a bit of a tourist attraction, and as I said, you can go to French Guiana. You can take a ship there. Royal Caribbean goes there, of course, and you can tender ashore and walk around St. Joseph's Island and Royal Island. And you used to be able to go across to Devil's Island as well, but there was a cable car stretching across between the two islands, but that's stopped now. And that cable car used to be used to take over, send over food and letters to the political prisoners, including Dreyfus, who were on that island. But as I said, that cable car is stopped now. But you can walk across the island, and you can see just a short way across Dreyfus's hut across the other side, and you think, well, why wouldn't they try to escape? But then you see the currents that sweep through that area, and you can see why. In the 1970s, refugees from Laos and Vietnam who had survived the Vietnam War were resettled in the area, and there's a big Vietnamese community there now. And in 1965, President de Gaulle decided that he was going to start a European space station, and they sent up the Guyana Space Centre in the area. And because of that, French Guiana, and this is one of the cells on St. Joseph's Island where Papillon, as I said, he carved his name into the wall while he was there for 5 years. But because of the space agency, French Guiana is now the most prosperous country in South America with the highest GDP. And it's due to all the subsidies that are given to the area because of the space station. So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the talk today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think I'm talking again in here in 2 days' time at 9 o'clock again. I'll be down here to answer any questions that you may have before I leave. The talk in 2 days' time is about one of my great heroes, probably my greatest hero, and that's Ernest Shackleton. And I hope you come along to that. It's probably it's called Beyond Endurance, and it's probably one of the greatest stories of survival ever told. So hope to see you then, and thank you. See you around the ship.